Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing The Wicked Boy, The Mystery of a Victorian Child Murderer by Kate Summerscale. So this is an audiobook that I listened to. It was very enjoyable. I had a really good time reading it, even though I'm not usually a true crime fan. And I think this is a fascinating book about a lesser known case that took place in the late 1800s. So we're going to be reviewing that today. I think it's important to note that I read this in audiobook format because I do find that the format in which I read or consume a book matters. I do tend to retain a little bit less information from audiobooks versus like a physical print book. I think some of it just has to do with me doing other things while listening to an audiobook, but also I find myself less able to take notes. But I did take some notes and I have them on my computer off to the side here, so I will be referencing that. The Wicked Boy focuses on one particular character, Robert Coombs. We'll call him Robert, and Natty, his brother. So Robert is 13 and Natty is 12. They also have a third character who's going to come up a lot, John Fox, age 39, and Emily Coombs, she's important too. We'll get into it. So this is both a true crime book and a look at life in Victorian London. And I think one of the reasons why this didn't bother me as much as other true crime books does is due to the fact that the crime was so old. It doesn't feel relevant, or it doesn't feel like it's something that is relevant, like pressing to me. If I read a modern true crime or a true crime that happened in the last 30 years, those kind of freak me out. But something from the 1800s feels like more of a historical read versus feeling like something that is imminently dangerous to me. And there's a lot of historical elements that we get into that is discussed as well that I think makes the book really relevant, even if you're not really into true crime. So when the book opens, we meet Robert and Natty, who are apparently home alone. Their father works out on vessels, on ships, so he's gone, and Robert and Natty are going about their day. They seem to be unaccompanied. First of all, father's gone. Mother, we don't know where she is. Robert, at age 13, he goes to the neighbors and says, hey, can you pay our landlady? We have to pay rent. Here's our rent book. Here's the money for it. And they go, sure. One of them, he exchanges money to get like, I don't remember the denominations, but it's like the equivalent of like taking a 20 and being like, can I get 2 10s? And then the boys go and watch cricket. There's this big cricket player in town, something Grace, I think it is. They're gonna go watch that. So they go watch cricket. And then they go down to the docks and they find John Fox. Quickly learn John Fox is a dock worker, someone who works on ships down at the docks. He does appear to have a little bit of a mental like disorder or deficiency, so he's not quite, doesn't always quite act like an adult, but he is an adult, which is important because Robert and Natty would like to pawn some possessions and the pawn shops are not going to talk to a 12 and 13-year-old. So John Fox gets recruited into these boys' work and he starts pawning these objects. And we start to think, where's the mother? And they want some more money, so we're going through several days here. Robert tries to forge a doctor's note to try to get some advances on his father's salary. That's kind of questionable. And at this point too, friends, families, and neighbors are starting to come over to the house and being like, hey, where's Emily, your mother? And Robert says, she's visiting, she's gone. And the people are getting more and more suspicious. And the women are like, no, she wouldn't go visit there because she would have told us. And it's very odd that she just disappeared. And eventually 2 women, I think it was like a neighbor and a family member, if I remember correctly, get a spare key and they force themselves into the house. And they are like, what's going on? Why is the bedroom door locked? And they open the bedroom door and they discover Emily, the mother of Robert and Natty, to be deceased on the bed. Apparently stabbed, apparently had been murdered. She has been deceased for several days. There's now starting to be a smell, even though the smell was kind of contained because clearly someone had tried to cover it up. It was like lime or something over the body and the door had been shut. And immediately there's a lot of questions. Here's one of the first things. The moment that the dead body is discovered, one of the women says, you bad boy, about the discovery, which is like the understatement of a century because it very quickly becomes apparent and he all but confesses it that Robert stabbed his mother, which is a very shocking crime for a 13-year-old to stab their mother. It is very, very rare. And we'll get into the psychology of young boys who commit matricide later in this review. But this kicks off the whole thing. So Robert at age 13 is hauled off to jail for murder, essentially. He has to go to court and the judge says, yep, you have to go to jail. And people are collapsing in court. And this is a very, very, very shocking case. Something that comes up. So a lot of this book is then playing out the case and then what happens to Robert, as well as some speculation on what drove him to commit this murder. Something that's going to come up right away is, and I hope I say this word correctly, phrenology, which was the belief that you could like study someone's head and see what their character might be like. And this was used for all sorts of bad and like racist depictions or like conclusions throughout life, throughout history, I should say. And it's basically a discredited field, but phrenology was big, and there was also some concerns because Robert had been a forceps birth, which I believe means the child gets stuck in like the birth canal, and so they take like these little pinchers and pull them out, is my understanding. I've never given birth, but that seems pretty horrible, and I hope they have better methods nowadays. Maybe they don't, but he had marks on the side of his head and he suffered from headaches, so that is used. There's also a whole section in court where there's discussion on whether or not Robert was influenced by this cheap literature called penny dreadfuls, which were these like cheap fictional things that appealed to young boys that were full of adventure, as well as like just crass morals and all sorts of questionable behavior, which if we think about that, this is a reoccurring thing throughout history. I mean, if you go on YouTube today and look up people talking about like book talk, you hear people talking about the downfall of literature is falling, well, bad literature is influencing people. I've seen so many arguments about how like smut is ruining young women, and I'm not going to comment on anything about literature, but I am going to say that this is clearly a conversation that's been going on for a while, because the downfall of literature was attributed to penny dreadfuls. These had a lot of, they believed and it did have some gore in it, and they thought that this gore that the boys were reading was contributing to violence. This has been done not just for books, but also video games. I know there was a lot of things about Satanism and rock and roll back in the day. So this is an ongoing problem throughout generations, and it's very, very interesting to see many common arguments come up again for these penny dreadfuls. There were, at this point, many other times referenced in the book where the author talks about other times penny dreadfuls had been brought up to explain someone's behavior. For example, so you could be prosecuted, my understanding, and I didn't realize this was a thing, you could be prosecuted after the fact, I suppose, of committing suicide, and because that is in the Victorian understanding, self-murder and murder is a crime, so you couldn't murder yourself. And one of them, it was a boy who had committed suicide, and he said suicide, it was ruled as suicide committed, or suicide during temporary insanity induced by the reading of trashy novels. So this was clearly something that was prevalent in society. The penny dreadfuls were accused of having a, quote, unhinging and mesmeric effect, which if any of my books have an unhinging and mesmeric effect that I'm reading, that sounds interesting. Robert is accused of being influenced by these books, which is novelistic literature of a sensational character, which is just a sentence that I think I want to work in more. So it's been, these penny dreadfuls have been linked to inducing insanity, which might lead one to act outside of their normal self. Obviously, our understanding of mental health is not where it is today. It wasn't in that era. But these penny dreadfuls are really accused of a lot of things, and Robert was a reader of the penny dreadfuls, so there was this idea that maybe he was inspired by those books, which definitely had some questionable language and content. Some were read out in the audiobook, and it's definitely like not content you would want to publish or read now necessarily. Definitely a lot of like sexist and racist things, like overtly, like you don't even have to reach it. Overtly is just in there, and it probably was quite violent to read, but whether or not that induced him to act in any sort of way is a little bit more questionable. So Robert gets hauled off because now they need to try him to figure out if what his penalty is going to be, and he gets taken to the prison. It was interesting to note that padded cells existed even then. He gets put in one. And then there's this whole section where the author goes into childhood psychology and childhood development, which was still developing at this time. So there was this push and pull at the time between whether or not children were savage and evil inherently. So was it the penny dreadfuls, or was he just inherently savage and evil? Versus this other idea where children are just little adults, and so they don't need anything special. There's nothing special about their development. There was, I guess, a really big push forward in this field from James Sully, where children are complex and vulnerable, and adult treatment of a child impacts their fate, which I think is probably a view more in line with our understanding today. Children are complex and vulnerable, and adult treatment of a child impacts their fate. That's probably a statement most of us would agree on. How a child is treated is going to have a massive impact on them. But childhood psychology and child development is going to come up again and again. So something else that comes up is Robert states that there was like abuse in the home and that Emily was like had like hit them, and it had been recommended that Robert not be hit because of his forceps birth, because there was like damage to his head. So there was some complaints that Emily was being a little too physically violent with her children, and that's what caused it. Something that happens in the middle of this trial is their father comes home. So Robert, being halfway across the world in New York, receives word that his wife is killed and his son has been accused of it, and he rushes home. And we should also note that all three of these boys are on trial, or two boys, one adult, but that's John Fox. So Robert clearly did the stabbing, but there's how much is Natty involved, the younger boy at 12? And did John Fox know about this murder and attempt to cover it up, because he gets mixed up with the boys after the fact? So Robert is going to quickly try to save one son by throwing the other under the bus. He wants Natty to be absolved of everything because he wants to throw Robert under the bus as being insane. And the insanity is something that is going to be pushed as, because that's another question in this trial, is whether or not Robert was fully mentally there when he stabbed his mother, because he did kill her. She admits it. There's never any question about that. He's very open about having stabbed her, but it's whether or not he was of right mind when he did it is going to be the question in court. There's also, again, of course, the question about how much Fox knew about the crime and whether or not he was aware of it. It's very clear that he's not, he has like I don't know what the correct phrasing would be, not even like learning disability, like mentally deficient. Like he isn't fully like developmentally there. But he was competent enough to be an adult. It's just, and also there were things that may have happened, like Robert was intentionally trying to cover the smell, and John Fox, I guess, didn't have any reason to question why the mom wasn't there. So John Fox is also like taken out of this case pretty quickly. He's not considered guilty. He doesn't have to face, isn't facing capital punishment for that. And Natty is also, they determine he's not going to be, he isn't even tried. He's taken out of it right away. Robert, while in jail, kind of has this weird nervous energy. He says at one point, I think I will get hung, but I don't care as long as I get a good breakfast beforehand. And he's kind of alternating between this like bravado, but also this like fear, because he cries over missing his cats and his mandolin. I believe he may have pawned the mandolin, but he cries over these, but then he goes and says like, well, I don't care if I get hung. I think I'm going to get hung. Pawnbrokers are brought into court. I like how they say, there's a quote in the book, many pawnbrokers were familiar with giving testimony in court as they found themselves in possession of stolen goods, which was kind of just a funny quote. But this was kind of the news of the time, and people were kind of sensationalized by this news that a boy would kill his mother. It's quite rare, and enterprising businessmen sweep in on this opportunity. There are articles, there are souvenirs, like little wax figurines they're making. There was even a penny theater that had a melodrama about Robert. So while all this is going on, there's some businessmen who are kind of making a buck off this, trying to get some cheap entertainment and thrills off this. The court, of course, as we've already discussed, the main question is whether or not Robert was mentally sound when he committed this crime. So there's discussion of his academic achievement, that he achieved 6th standard, which I guess was like a top thing. One interesting point about that, and this is where we're kind of delving into like life in Victorian London, such as like childhood psychology, childhood development, penny dreadfuls, the education system. Recurring fractions was something, or recurring decimals was something that you had to understand past 6th standard, but girls did not have to answer recurring decimals, which was very interesting. And I wish I knew that when I was in 6th grade, because I definitely had to answer questions about that. But I guess in Victorian London, they decided girls didn't need to know that to pass. It was just a side note that I thought was interesting. There was a whole discussion about how women managed household finances, because women usually controlled household budgets and boys and men handed money over to women. So there may have been this point where Robert, having passed out of school, was he earning enough money? Did he feel like he could contribute to the household? Was there tension between him and his mother over that? Because there was accusations that she wasn't giving money back to Robert as like pocket money, which would have been expected. There was a lot of worry about overeducating the poor, I guess, in Victorian society. So too much study or homework would have a negative effect on children. So did that play into Robert's mental state? All of these and the whole atmosphere around Victorian London is kind of coming into the courtroom and playing out in this case. Trial occurs, and Robert is of course found guilty of the crime, but he decides he is insane. And the general consensus was that the jury didn't want him hung because of his age, so they decided to give insanity, even though they may not have truly thought him to be insane. In reality, it was unlikely he ever would have been executed, as no one his age had been executed for a long time. He probably his sentence would have been commuted due to his age in reality. And the jury decided just to play it safe and say he was insane and he would be sent to Broadmoor instead. There was an outcry over this. They said, this generation is getting too soft, which we've heard that before too, because they had decided to go with the insane verdict as opposed to finding him guilty just outright and letting the courts decide his fate from that. The book then goes on to his stay in Broadmoor, which is a psychiatric facility, mental hospitals where people who were determined to be insane went. I'm using the term insane because that's the term that they used. I don't know what the term they use now is. I know it's like can't be held. Some terms might be like you're not criminally, like you can't be held criminally responsible. I don't know what the correct term is nowadays, but like insanity was the plea and the phrasing that they were using at this time. So I'm using a lot of the terminology which might not line up with current court terms. So there was a fascinating deep dive at what Broadmoor was like during Robert's stay, and he was in there from 13 to 30. So he was in there until he was finally released and deemed to be sane. Surprisingly, a lot of things sounded very similar to how current institutions are run, like counting the knives and people getting different levels of freedom based on their level of mental ability. Robert, with one exception, one little time where he was moved to a higher class, was in this very low security time. He seemed to be very stable the entire time, and was eventually released and moved to Australia, where he adopted a son. He had some service in the war, and he lived out his life basically without really referencing that period of time ever again. There is some outstanding questions about his motive. The author leans into the abuse side, that the mother was very abusive, or was there maybe a true mental issue? Maybe the force at birth actually did something to his psychology or the brain structure. And there's a whole section which I found very interesting on the psychology of matricide by young boys, because that is a very, very rare crime. Matricide in general is a very rare crime, but matricide by young boys is very, very rare, and it seems to be a very one-off act that's sometimes committed, and then a lot of relief is felt by the perpetrator after the fact. So the psychology of what causes someone to do this, in this case, we will probably never know what caused Robert to commit it. If you have any thoughts, then please put it in the comment section down below. But this book was just so fascinating. The whole crime, the whole look at life in Victorian London, the whole look at the boy and how he managed things. Just everything about this book was absolutely fascinating, and I highly, highly recommend. If you have any thoughts, please leave it in the comment section down below. I love to receive your thoughts and comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.